Professor Moorosi, thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today. You talk about women leadership. Now, it's an old age reality that women have been serving as leaders across the globe on a micro level, as managers in their homes, in politics, and in society at large. What's the disconnect between women being leaders at home and being leaders in a professional space?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. And that's just the point, right? The point is just there. There isn't anyone who does not appreciate the fact that women have been leaders since eternity. I grew up in a family where my mother was there. My father was a migrant laborer, and he was hardly ever there. And my mother brought us up very effectively. Look at me. But I think that that is just the problem, that when it comes to the workplace, there seems to be a sudden change and shift to how society begins to perceive women. And maybe just because women happen to be good as homemakers, society tends to think that that's what women are good at, and that their role should be confined to that particular private space. So I think that's where the disconnect is. When it comes to pay, we see more men claiming the space, just as we see more men claiming the space when the children are successful. And when the children are not successful, it's your child, referring to the woman. So I think the disconnect is just there.
And what, in your view, are barriers to women taking up space of leadership, not only in a corporate space, but also in the space of higher education?
The barrier is just how society perceives of women, because how society thinks of women has a way of infiltrating how organizations treat women, because it is the very same society that runs organizations, right? And unfortunately, most of the organizations are still run and led by men. And I'm not saying the men are the devil here, but I'm saying that when you look into the whole leadership discourse, then you realize that it's always been about men leading organizations. You rightly put it at the beginning that women have been doing leadership all the time. But when it comes to organizations, formal organizations, it's been the men's game. So that's why it becomes really difficult, even with organizations that are trying to include women in the space, because that is the masculine male space. And for women to be successful, the pressure is that they have to play the game using the men's rules. But where do they have an opportunity to learn those male rules? That is the problem. So that is why we talk a lot about issues of mentoring, issues of disrupting and changing the status quo. Because if we don't change the status quo, it means we leave the organizational and the cultural structures as they are. Yet we want to include more women in that space. And that is the space that is not helping them at all. Because we want them to be women. We appreciate the fact that they lead more collaboratively. They include everyone. They are more sensitive. They bring that sensitive touch. We appreciate all that. But how do we then make the organizational spaces accommodating of those? And how do we value those kinds of leadership qualities that we tend to associate to women? How do we reward women for these? There are times when women are being criticized precisely for being too soft. And yet at times they were brought into organizational leadership precisely for that. And yet when they are there, then we criticize them for being, you are too, you treat them like children and you behave like a mother. Hello, isn't that why you brought me here? So how do we and when do we value that the leadership qualities of women that we tend to think, even though some men may have these qualities, but we tend to associate them more with women? When do we get to value that and reward women for those qualities?
Prof, in your presentation, one of the concepts that you spoke of was that of women leadership and gender. And you made reference to the fact that some of the studies tend to move away from women leadership and include gender so that they can be inclusive of boys and men. What could be the discourse that we are unable to talk about gender in the context of women without including men in it?
Yes. Actually, the point was that studies of women focused more on gender to include men. And your question is, why did we need to do that? Why do we need to? What's wrong with talking just about women? And I think one of the points I raised in the presentation was the fact that it hasn't proven to be helpful to focus exclusively on women and leave men out of the conversation. Because when we do that, men tend to think gender problems are women's issues and they are not part of the conversation. And we want them to be part of the conversation. So one thing that we appreciate about, I'm sure you'd be familiar with the different perspectives or movements of feminism. And one thing we appreciate about the African, what I'll call African feminism or African perspective of feminism, is that it emphasizes the inclusion of men in the discourse. We want men to be part of the conversation, because if we leave them out, from our programs of leadership development, if you leave them out from the conversation, then they are left behind, and it doesn't help us. And this is where the disconnect becomes, because then the mindsets are not changed. Men's mindsets stay in the past. We are trying to advance, and that's why some research has found women-only development programs unhelpful, because they only focus on women, leaving men out, and that in itself is not necessarily problematic, focusing on women only. But the point is that when we do that, then we create the conversation. It's almost like talking to the converted. And the very people who need to hear how we feel about how they treat us is the men who are in charge of organizations, the men who tend to be more powerful in their homes. As African people, we tend to give men that space, that authority. But if they don't know how we feel about these issues and we make it our own exclusive little thing that we talk about in our own little spaces, when are they going to know about this? And when are they going to know how we feel? And when are they going to get to a point where they feel they have to change the way they think about women? You know, I was having a conversation with a friend recently who was worried that their boy child is being influenced by someone who's supposed to be a male role model, but has ideas that are not very helpful. And she was concerned that I have raised this child with values that I think are going to prepare this boy to be a man who understands how to respect women, a man who understands how to respect society, a man who understands how to present themselves in society. Now they are being influenced by this someone who doesn't subscribe to those values. And she was quite worried. And I think, and I know that this is not applicable to all men. There are men that we rely on. There are men that have been there to champion women and make sure that they are there in the conversation. But we need to reach out much wider.
Prof, you mentioned feminism. What is feminism? And maybe to add on to that, in this era of digitalization, how can we have meaningful conversations on feminism and gender where honest, accurate information is shared?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think I get even more worried about this world of digitalization, because everybody has a view and everybody has access to airing their view out there. It doesn't matter what that view is. And that's where I see the danger. You know, nobody's there to filter what anybody says. And so whatever your views are, even if you are a hater of whatever kind, you could hate women, you could hate Black people, you could hate whatever. There's no filter. You can just say whatever you like and put it out there. And unfortunately, some people still believe whatever is on air, whatever is available on a digital device is the gospel truth. And that's where the problem is. But I think feminism is about understanding that we all matter. It's about understanding that women matter as much as men do matter. And it's about how do we position ourselves for championing women when it comes to leadership, which was the focus of the presentation today. How do we champion women's leadership, but women in leadership as well? And understanding that women have as much to offer as men do, and understanding that for a long time, for like forever, women have been in a space where they are looked down upon. They are not being given enough value and recognition for the work that they do. They are not being rewarded for the work that they do. They are not even paid equally to men, whom sometimes they work even harder than or have more responsibilities. So it's about understanding all that. It's about understanding that the world is maybe the world was not initially equal, but I think that the world was initially equal. And it's how we were socialized into it. It's how we as human beings, may not be you and I, but how human beings turned it around. And then we tend to socialize generation after generation into certain ways of thinking about the inequalities between men and women. And that's where movements like feminism come in to say, hang on a minute, we are all equal here. So let's begin to treat each other like that. And just to champion the role that women can play in society and in the workplace.
Prof, your work is centered around such issues: feminism, masculinity, leadership. Can these concepts coexist, feminism and masculinity? And in coexisting, can they foster a healthy environment?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that make us, one of the points, my departure point in the presentation was that when I started doing this work, it feels like we were still where we were then, back 20 years ago. And I think one of the reasons is because we try to work in silos, and I think the value of conferences like these, the MITC, what's that mouthful again? Transdisciplinary. The value of conferences like this is that to bring people, different people in the same space. And not only that, but to get us think about problems in different ways. So these different ways is exactly what you're saying about how do we bring different perspectives to coexist, and what is it that we can draw from that coexistence in driving. Because I think we are at a place in time where we realize that we don't need one solution to solve the world's problems. We'll need multiple solutions. And focusing on different disciplines and using different theoretical perspectives, using different ways of thinking about problems is precisely what we need and can address that.
Prof, you mentioned as one of the problems that if we use representation figures, it's a problem, especially if it is used to measure the success of women in leadership. What, in your view, would be an accurate measure in the African context?
Yeah, I think the point is just there. We don't need to measure success with one measure. And I'm not saying that it is wrong to count the number of women who have made it to leadership and celebrate and appreciate that. I'm not saying that is wrong. That is correct, but it cannot be the only measure. Because then what are we saying to the rest of the female society? We are saying in order for us as the world to recognize your success, you have to be the vice chancellor of a university. Let's face it, how many women can be vice chancellors of a university? So I think it's about, and that's why I presented that whole problematization, which I believe would help us into thinking about different solutions to problems and not just thinking about one. So defining success for me can be looked in multiple ways. So we don't only have to wait for women to make it to the top to begin to reward them for the great work that they do, because there's numerous things that they do before they get there. There's numerous things that other numerous women do, but they don't necessarily get to the top. But if how we perceive success in leadership is by that measurement of the number of women in top leadership positions, if that becomes the only measure, then we are missing out on a whole range of women in between that are doing great things that are not appreciated, that are not even recognized, that are not even known about. And that's just where the argument is for me.
And I mean, drawing from what your opening remarks were, where you said the problems that we had 20 years ago sort of we haven't really moved far from where we were. Are there any strides that we have seen? I mean, you say there have been positive things, that have happened. Women have evolved, and even in the context of leadership.
Yes.
Are there any strides where women have taken up space, and we have success stories?
Yes, we have lots of success stories. But the unfortunate thing is that until and unless the woman has made it to the very top, that's the only time we get to hear about them. So we may not, the world may not have moved miles in terms of gender equality, closing that gap, but there has been some significant milestones. For one, the number of women in leadership positions has increased. The number of women changing their attitudes has increased. We see more women in universities now, and actually the women surpass men in university enrollments. And sometimes the problem lies just there to say, if we have more women in university enrollments, where do they go? How come when you get to the employment, particularly as we go higher up the employment ladder, that women begin to drop out and begin to be less or fewer? What happens with them? So we have made some significant strides. We have men, great men who are I hate using that phrase, sorry. But we have men who are now in the conversation because it's got connotations with the great leadership theory. And that's why I don't hate saying men are great. That's not what I mean. But we have men who are joining in the conversation, men who are recognizing that the way they have thought about these issues is wrong and it needs to change. And they are really genuinely keen in joining the discourse and helping the world, not even helping women. I think that's still another misconception. You're not helping women. You are helping society to try and deal with these issues so that the world can benefit. I mean, we all know the expression that you educate a woman, you educate the community or the nation. And that doesn't change. And that's why we need more women in spaces, in all work environments. So if we limit the role of women, or we don't appreciate, or we don't even recognize when we have more female students in our PhD programs, what are we saying about their achievements? So we may actually look into the number of women who pass and get their PhDs, get the DR title, but don't even look at those who get their master's degrees, because we are focusing at the top. So if it's about the end of the study, the top qualification, that's where we are looking. We are not looking at the number of women who graduate and with what degrees, who they are, where they come from, what are their backgrounds, what have they brought, what are their communities, what hurdles have they had to jump in order for them to be where they are. We are not looking at any of those things, but we are just looking at those who end and finish and get the DR title. So the same thing applies across the board. We need to start thinking more about the different levels of success of women. And that is precisely the focus of my talk, to problematize how we think about success, so that it's not just about preparing and thinking about women at the top of the leadership and only conceiving that as success, because there are many successes before we get to that top one.
And finally, Prof, you have been, I don't want to say fortunate, but you have had exposure in experiencing the higher education sector locally as well as internationally. How has the bridge in terms of academic excellence where women are concerned been given the two contexts? So you've got the African context and you've got the European context. Do you find that one values women in education more than the other?
I think the world thinks like that. The reason I enjoy being where I am is to be the voice, not that the voice, but be one of the voices about the context of Africa and the good things that we do. And I talk very proudly about the fact that I am researching the African space, the African context, because I want that to be known globally. So you know about the whole movement of decolonizing the curriculum, for example. That was initiated in South Africa, but is now a global discourse, because what happened was everybody suddenly realized that actually we've been teaching students about European theorists. What about theorists from other parts of the world? What about theorists and scholars and thinkers and philosophers from Africa? You know, what about models of leadership from the African continent, from the African cultures? What do we know about those? So I see my role, that the fact that I was brought up in the African continent. I started working in the African continent. I did my PhD in the African continent, and then I went abroad. For me, that is a strength, because it has given me tools to look at my context, my African context, and I say that with pride. My African context with a critical eye, appreciating what we do well, but also areas where we need to improve. But also looking into the European context where I am and looking at how they view other parts of the world, not just Africa. And that superiority complex is there. And my role and the role of others, maybe academics and other people in the diaspora, is to challenge those notions and make them aware that, yes, maybe Europe brought something to Africa, but there's also a lot that Europe took from Africa. And unless that is appreciated and acknowledged, Europe will probably always think that it is better than Africa. So the whole idea is for I think for all of us who are in the diaspora space, we see our role in that light, you know, the light where we challenge the taken for granted truths, claims, issues, knowledge, whatever you name them, and we want to bring to the world that Africa has a lot to offer, and we are here, we are products of that, and we want to show the rest of the world that there is some good in Africa. It's not just the sun, but there's a whole range of things that are good about it.
Prof, thank you so much for joining our conversation. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.